I'm Jono Buchanan, and in a previous video I had a chance to show you the beginnings of Scupture. Scupture being this incredible physical modelling instrument that exists within Logic. Unlike regular synthesizers, what it does is to basically build a string, if you like, and whether that string's built out of nylon or steel or wood or glass, what we're going to effectively do is begin to kind of stimulate the string, get it moving in various ways, and produce some amazing tones along the way. Now, Dan Friedman asked me whether or not I could begin to explore some of the modulation options within Scupture as well. And this is going to effectively take us into a sort of second part of Scupture. So we've looked at the upper section where we have a chance to begin to see how we can construct a sound in the first place. And what we're going to do in this video is to begin to explore some of the modulation possibilities. Now, I say begin to because they are unbelievably extensive. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus our areas in the bottom left-hand corner of Scupture to start with, this area down here, to begin to see what all of these objects are, what we can do, and how we can begin to get sounds moving in intriguing ways. And then in a later video, we're going to look at some of the other modulation options as well. So what I've done is to open Scupture and to load this sound called Ambient Intrigue, which sounds like this. So I've just jumped up the octave. It's got this really introspective, beautiful sound, and you can begin to hear that it's warping and moving. Now, I really recommend that you watch the first Scupture video first. But before we simply move on to looking at modulation, let's have a whistle-stop tour of how this sound is being built right now. So what we've got are three objects, all of which are getting our virtual string moving in various ways. This one is bowing it, this one is using the bow wide sort of trigger, and this one is using the bouncing trigger. All of them are set to key on, which means that straight away, the moment I press a key, they are all working on the sound. We can see the pickup positions of exactly where they are placed along the string. And I can see that at the moment, my virtual string is made of a kind of combination of nylon and steel, because this sort of material square, the little ball dictating the position of it, is set over here to the left-hand side. And effectively, I can see that we're using the low-pass filter on the sound as well. So this, obviously, I could open up to make the sound brighter. Or I can pull it back down to make it duller again. So just having a bit of a look around, we can see in particular how the objects are working on this particular sound. Now, like I said, what we're going to do mostly is to focus on how we can begin to get sounds moving and evolving using the controllers down here in the bottom left-hand corner. Now, some of these are labelled in ways that we're going to recognise, like the LFOs, for example. We know the LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, and what that does is to introduce a waveform like this sine wave shape, which can then interrupt something in the sound chain. So for example, if I wanted to route the LFO to the output level, for instance, what would effectively happen is the sound will get loud and quiet and loud and quiet and loud and quiet, effectively interrupting that particular parameter. Now, let's start with the LFOs. So what I can see straight away within Scupture is that I have a chance to choose the waveform that I want to use as a shape, and we'll stick with the sine wave for now. And then in terms of controlling its speed, I can either do that in a free way, so that effectively I'm just choosing a speed in hertz, cycles per second, or I can synchronize it to the tempo of the project that I'm working on. So if I wanted this to be synchronized in quarter notes, I could do exactly that. What I can also do is to change the shape by using its curve dial here, and you can see the little waveform is morphing and changing. So I get away from a kind of regular square wave to something much more like a regular sine wave to something more like a square wave over here. And then we've got a slightly more interesting sort of random shape over here on the left-hand side, or not random, but interrupted in different ways, a kind of modulated sine wave, if you like. So effectively, I've got different controls which are allowing me to change all kinds of things about the way that this LFO looks, if you like. In terms of actually getting it plugged in to something, I have the opportunity to choose two separate targets. And what we'll do to make life easy for a moment is we'll turn one of them off. I can turn on and off target assignments here simply by clicking on their numbers. So firstly, what I can do is to say, okay, well, what do I want to target. So at the moment, this LFO is on and it is targeting the position of object 1. Now remember, object 1 is this bowed trigger for my string, and the position of it is going to control where it appears on this string line. So effectively what I'm in a position to do, if I want to, is to modulate that by turning up the amount. So this is sending LFO1, which has this shape and is playing back at this speed, into the position of object 1, and now it's going to modulate. Now it's doing that incredibly subtly, and the reason for that is due to the delicate balance of all of the sort of combination, I suppose, of the elements that exist within this sound. So what do I mean by that? Well, depending on exactly what combination of materials I'm using, depending on the string, depending on how strongly the bow sound is contributing to getting that string moving in the first place, and a whole range of other factors, either we're going to discover that LFO assignments are incredibly dramatic, or they're almost so subtle to hear that we can't hear them. So let's get another assignment going in and we'll see what happens when we change something else. So now what I'm going to do is to change object 1's timbre as well as its position. So this is again using exactly the same shape. This is the amount dial, which is bringing in the amount of this modulation, and we'll see what this does to the sound. Okay, it's a completely new noise. Now remember, I've done two things. Firstly, I've introduced this, but also I've changed the material square. So if we put this back where it was, that's kind of an amazing sound. So straight away, simply by, and we could remember, we could automate that movement if we wanted to. So simply by changing the material square with this movement that's coming in, effectively what happens is we're changing the behavior of the way that one of the objects is interacting with the string. And what we're doing over here is changing what that string is made of. And as a result of that, rather than the kind of slight predictability of working with LFOs within synthesizers, because we're changing the core makeup of the material of the sound, the impact of that LFO assignment is really dramatic depending on what the string is made of. I hope that makes sense. Now then, what we've then got a chance to do is to apply exactly the same logic using, no pun intended, using a second LFO. So we've got exactly the same parameters, an opportunity to choose a waveform once again to choose a speed for it, whether or not we want that to be free or synchronized. Again, let's just choose something synchronized, but maybe a bit faster this time. I'll go for 16th notes. We can choose the shape that we want, having selected a waveform here, lots of options there. And then what we can do is to decide where we want to assign it. So again, what we can do is to choose a target. And this time, rather than going with the ones that are already sort of pre-selected, what we might do is to choose something else. So this time I'm going to choose the timbre of object number 2, which is this second one here. And I'm choosing that just pretty much at random. And then what I'm in a position to do is just again, turn up the amount of it that I want. Now you might be wondering why there's a positive and a negative slider. Effectively choosing negative values will invert the shape of the LFO movement. Now for something moving in 16th notes like I've selected, we're probably not going to really hear too much difference. But if you imagine that you'd chosen a ramp shape, if you were to invert it, instead of ramping up, it would ramp down. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so we've got our shape here and we're plugging this in to object number 2. Now, What's interesting about this as well is that in addition to simply setting a static assignment, what we can also do is just set up what's called a via control. So if I wanted to, I could introduce this movement somehow or via a particular parameter. So if I decided, for example, that I wanted velocity to control the amount of this, what that would mean would be we'd hear more of the effect of this if I hit louder velocities than if I hit quieter ones, unless I invert it, in which case quieter velocities will deliver more of the effect. So let's turn that up and keep it sort of in proportion for now. So now I've got velocity control over whatever this LFO is going to do to object number 2. Wow. Okay, so what we're going to do is move the material square around again. Let's just see what happens. I'm going to back both of those down a little bit and introduce something much more subtle. Just amazing sounds. And again, we're just really getting started with what the kind of possibilities are. But if you're interested in sound design or you're interested in productions that are using unusual textures, remember, you can load this preset, it's in the pads, and all we've done is just to begin to experiment with LFOs. And again, I'll reiterate, it's because they are working on a string in unpredictable ways that these incredibly subtle little movements have massive implications for the way that the sounds then unfold. Okay, so let's unpick a couple of things. I'm going to turn off these LFO routings so that we're not going nuts with them, and instead we'll move on to the jitter sort of section here. Now, effectively, these are also a bit like LFOs. We have a chance to literally inject a kind of jitter effect, if you like, into a specific target. Now, again, you can see all the lights are off right now. So if I turn this on, we're effectively turning that this modulation on. I can then choose the target for it. Again, lots of options here in terms of things I could aim at. Let's go with pitch, might be quite an interesting thing to change. And then literally I can just drag in the amount of change that I want. And how fast is a jitter circuit? Well, it's up to 100 Hertz and its lowest rate is 0.1 Hertz. So really slow if we want a sort of slow introduction of a sound or a change to a sound. It sort of feels like the catchphrase of this channel should be, if you're not enjoying that, you're watching the wrong channel. This is so much fun. Okay, so we've got our pitch in there, and of course what we could do would be to choose other targets as well. So literally the position of object 3 again, if we wanted to, or any of the options really relating to the objects and the way that they interact with this sort of virtual string that we're working with. So what we've effectively got is 2 separate jitter circuits, and we've got speeds, individual controls, and each of those can target 2 separate parameters. So that's jitter. Let's turn those off. You can see, by the way, that if I instantiate one of these things, the jitter circuit sort of gets bolded like this. So I can see at a glance, if I'm looking at the LFOs, that something is happening with the jitter circuits, whereas if I come in here and turn that off, it won't be bold. So at a glance, I can see right now that something's happening with vibrato, nothing's happening with velocity, but something's happening with controllers A and B, and we'll come to those in a moment. So vibrato is next. So effectively this circuit is currently on. Vibrato does what Vibrato does. It's going to introduce this idea of pitch variation, and we have a chance to decide exactly how we want to make that happen. And equally what we can do is to have this being introduced via the vibrato control if we want to, or we can just have a separate amount slider here. So the speed is here, the shape is here, again a bit like an LFO, but this is dedicated to vibrato, which is obviously going to provide us with pitch change. Sounds very excited, doesn't it? Which is great. So there's our vibrato circuit. Then what we have a chance to do is to move in fact, I'll just turn that off for now. We'll come back into what we can do with velocity. Now, literally, we can use velocity as a controller. We know that velocity is all about the strength of our playing. So if we hit a note hard, it's a loud or strong velocity. And if we hit it less hard, then it becomes something else. And we can use velocity as a control source within Scupture. So again, I can switch this on, and again, I can choose a particular target. So let's go with string stiffness. What I can then do is to decide exactly how velocity is going to respond depending on how hard I hit. Now, this obviously has a lot to do with the strength of the keys of your keyboard controller. If you're working with a weighted keyboard and you have to work harder to get louder velocities, you might choose not to go for a kind of linear introduction of velocity as we've got with this middle choice, but instead to introduce louder settings more quickly, or alternatively, you can reserve just the loudest velocities for the last section of your kind of curve that you're working with. So we pick a target here, and then we can introduce how much of this we want to have happen. And then effectively, having chosen that target and the shape that we want, we can introduce velocity as a trigger for whichever parameter we've selected. Very quiet velocity. That's crazy, crazy sound. Love it. Okay, what I'm also going to do is to introduce a little bit of filter cutoff via velocity as well. And what I'm also going to do is to reintroduce my LFOs a little bit as well and see how nuts this is going to get. Okay, and then we come into controllers A and B. Now, effectively, what we can do here within this pane is to decide how we want to use controller A and controller B to target more parameters. What are these? Well, they're set down here. Controller A is the modulation wheel, and again, I can choose and swap this out for any MIDI controller I like, and the same thing is true for controller B. So if I was working with the mod wheel for sure, but maybe also if I had a sustain pedal or a foot switch, or if I wanted to route individual control dials mapped to control surfaces to specific things. So for example, the mod wheel would be a good example. I can then say, okay, well, on introduction of the mod wheel, I can then choose the target here that I want to work with and then select the amount that I want to have that controller affect that particular parameter. Now, that's a lot of words from me, looking at just one section of how Scupture's modulation options can work. But hopefully you can see through the demonstrations that the change timbrally to the sounds that you're working on is absolutely vast. And of course, there is a huge amount of random involved too. As I've said, tiny changes to either the material square or particular amounts, literally linked maybe to velocity or to LFOs, is going to produce vastly different sounds. And unlike synthesizers where you sort of go, okay, yeah, I've hit that a bit harder, so it's a bit brighter or a bit louder, Scupture is going to throw amazingly unusual things at you all of the time. And often it's about saying, okay, well, I really like that. How has that happened? And can I record it and turn it into audio and use it as a means to use that sound alongside something a little bit more conventional maybe. But if you want to begin to explore some of these options, the bottom left-hand corner is a great place to start. And absolutely, we will look at some of the other modulation options in a future video as well.